I was looking at it.
You was looking at it. You was freaked out.
You're running me off.
Oh, myself. I won't sit here for a long problem.
Don't be shy.
You can't be got there, George.
Huh?
Can't be got there.
What?
You can't be got there.
Can't?
No, you gotta be up, just walking right behind the chairs. Yeah, but yeah, if you go right here, you can't be seen there. Yes.
Couple up in there.
More chairs.
Yeah, that's probably better to do.
Get out of the way. You just spoke for the we were over here. Yeah, but I think it's more chairs.
Hello there. I think we're bringing more chairs in.
Cheers, $1. Who wants a chair? Jim, you want that picture and just give it back to me someday? Okay.
Whoa, there's a couple seats left there. There may be one or two over on the corners.
Ready for me to start then?
Yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead.
You wanted this tell about yourself?
Yeah, I can do that. Thanks for coming out tonight. How you doing? Good. Thanks for coming out and supporting the McClure Historical Society. My name is Taylor Moyer. I am a historian. I do a lot of work around Northwest Ohio. I predominantly do most of my work out of Fort Wayne State Memorial Park up in Perrysburg. I'm a reenactor up there. I also worked at Sauter Village for 2.5 years, academics and newcomers. I do a lot of work for the Henry County Historical Society. I was board trustee there in 2007 and was the curator for the museum 2007 to 2010. Too many exhibits, loses track of the time. It makes it feel like I did it for like 20 years. But I'm a 2010 graduate of Northwest State Community College. I got an Associates of Arts there with a degree in Historic Preservation. I'm currently a student at BGSU. Hope to graduate next year with a Bachelor's of Science in AY Social Studies, so I'll be a social studies teacher hopefully. So we'll see. So that's a little bit about myself. I'm kind of along the realms of a social historian. There's lots of different historians that people tend to gear their studies towards. I do a lot of my work in the social side of things, how men and women interacted, what their social roles were during the time period, women's social roles, what was expected out of them politically, socially, really anything that deals with what society dictated is what I'm really interested in. So today I'm going to really highlight on that. This isn't really a talk or anything about big battles or facts and statistics or anything like that. So I'm just going to kind of jump into things here. First off, the Civil War is a very, very, very large topic to cover. I'm not going to put you to sleep. Hopefully I won't put you to sleep. If I do, just like raise your hand and I'll stop. Most of my work actually is done with the War of 1812. So the Civil War is something that I've really had to just delve into with the 150th anniversary here in the state of Ohio and around the rest of the United States. So I'm going to kind of start us back at the beginning of the war, kind of what set us up for where we were. And then I'm going to try to bring it back home here in McClure and Henry County so we get our local history and kind of understand what the role was of our people here. One thing that's really important when we do social history is realizing that we weren't there separating ourselves. A lot of times people get really tied into history and they argue about still today slaves' rights and political issues that the Civil War brought up. One of the big things we find is there's a book out that is called Confederates in the Attic. It's a book that talks about how the Confederate States are still alive and well down in the South, and that at any moment they will rise up, secede, and take back their part of the country. So there are certain issues socially today that still exist with issues that were brought up during the Civil War. The differences between the North and the South during the Civil War began in the early 1800s. What we had set up was the North and the South were separating already at the seams when it came to their population growth. The North was increasing in population really rapidly fast. We had a lot of big cities, and we had a much more industrialized region. Still today, we hope that we still have an industrialized region, but we know that now we're kind of looking at the Rust Belt, where a lot of our factories and industries have left. Down in the South, their economies and their populations were kind of splitting. What we see is their economy was booming and growing, but their population was not. And that already started to bring up sectionalism. Sectionalism was the belief and the kind of political idea and social idea that the country should be viewed in two halves, the South and the North. Population heavy, not so much, slavery, no slavery, and that line became to kind of begin to root itself in society. There was another issue that kind of came up, two major issues that I always kind of chuckle at socially because I feel like we kind of see this today with where we're at in society. One of them was taxes. Taxes paid on goods was a big, big issue. Since the South was exporting a lot of their materials, to Europe, unfortunately their ports were further away. What that meant was it was more expensive for them. They were paying more money, and the North said, too bad, we're not going to help you out. So there was tariffs that began to put on things, and the South just had to put up with it and pay for it. They kind of could pay for it because their economy was doing so well with the cotton industry and other plantations. However, it was a little unfair. What we begin to see then is exports sometimes had to pay higher amounts for shipping their goods overseas. Distances from southern ports, again, were further. And the unequal tariffs imposed by foreign countries also allowed for southern banks to be influenced by those costs. What we see is southern banks found themselves paying higher interest rates and on loans. So in 1857, there was a panic with the banks because the North had done some poor investing, and the South was forced to pay for that poor investing for their banks. Kind of something we've seen not too long ago. This should kind of harken back. And effectively, the South had enough. The Southern financiers were like, enough's enough. We're not paying for the North's mess-ups when it comes to how they're allotting their money. Kind of what, again, some of us have said today when it comes to banks and maybe not doing things the way they should be done. But that's a different argument, maybe. Another issue that we came to was the federal government, and what we saw was the federal government was increasing its power. They were settled out of Washington, D.C., which is in the north. That's one more strike for the north. South didn't feel they were being equally represented, fair representation in the government, and they felt that states' rights held more power than federal laws. They felt that their states knew what was best for them, especially because of their agricultural systems that they had developed. And they really didn't care what the federal government had to say. In certain circumstances, when dealing with slavery, tariffs, trade, loans, and all of those kinds of political issues, the South actually had a very, very fair argument when it came to Washington, D.C. being too far removed from their needs and their wants of their economy. Then what we get to is, of course, one of the bigger, what we now believe to be one of the biggest issues, but we don't want to take away from all those other problems. I started with those first problems of the banks and everything because the Civil War has kind of become known as a war that was all about slavery, and it wasn't just about slavery. But what we see is with all of the interest loans and all these issues, the agricultural systems and the economies, they were economies that were based on slave labor. I just got back from the South 4 days ago. Went down to the Carton Plantation, and that is in Kentucky, yes, Tennessee. It's a long trip from Ohio away to Panama City, so all those states run together. But Tennessee, stopped by the Carton Plantation. It was really interesting, really beautiful place. You should go down there sometimes. What we kind of found while we were down there is that their economy being based on slave labor was not built on the cotton industry. We kind of have a misleaded kind of idea up here in the north that all the slaves were picking cotton. All the plantations had at least 150 slaves. They had to have had that many. And that they were whipped, abused, and worked to the bone. This plantation wasn't so much that way. You could definitely see unequal rights there. The home was beautiful, and the slaves were in one-room cabins out back. But their industry there was based on potatoes and producing enough crop for themselves, and the slaves were actually responsible for taking care of the livestock. Their industry at that plantation in Tennessee was not based on cotton, so that was pretty interesting. However, interesting or not, during the start of the Civil War, slavery was a major issue. Every plantation in the South owned slaves. They were not huge plantations like we think of. Those are actually kind of the Hollywood view of what plantations ought to be. In general, most people own 2 to 10 slaves. The more wealthy plantations earning about around $6 million a year, owned about 38 to 40 slaves, and then all the way up to the most slaves owned by a plantation owner was around 289 to about 350. That's a lot of people to manage, and that's a lot of property to manage. During this time period, we see in the South that slaves were property, not people. This was an issue when it came to states' rights, because the Constitution says that everyone is guaranteed right to own property and protect everyone against the seizure of property. So, since slaves are property, that means you can't seize my property. So, when the United States government began to look into this, and then of course, this guy right here, this big bad guy, comes in and he says, you know, I don't agree with slavery, and he becomes the president of the United States. We have some very, very serious issues. And then, of course, 1861, the Confederates attack Fort Sumter. This flag here is a replica of a flag that was flying over Fort Sumter when the Confederates marched in and opened fire. It is called the eagle-crested flag. That is because when you get up and you check everything out, the stars are in the formation of an eagle. Each star represents each state, because by this time period, they've begun adding stars for those states. So that's kind of a setup there. Now we're going to move back home a little bit. We're going to get out of the South. We've developed our issues. We know what everyone's arguing over and soon be killing each other over. We come to Napoleon, Ohio. It's 1861, and Abraham Lincoln has called for troops. He's decided that the war will last 3 months. There's no way it can go any longer, because we have the money, we have the manpower, we have more population. Our economy, what did I say? It's great, it's booming. We can produce guns, bullets. This will be great, and we will just move into the South, take them over, get rid of slavery. There'll be no issues. 3 months, you're bound to come home. Shouldn't be really any issues. So they call for mustering camps in Napoleon, Ohio. They form Camp Laddie. That sits about on the corner where Frosty Boy is now. And then it stretches to the creek line there at Ritter Park, and then it stretches all the way back to the city pool. So I think there's about a ½ an acre left of the original campsite today. That's all that's left. The rest is cemetery, swimming pool, and ice cream. So they would have been eating a lot better today than that. Camp Laddie as a mustering camp, every county would have had a mustering camp. That meant all the guys from McClure, anywhere else in Henry County, would have went up to Napoleon. When you got to the mustering camp, you would have come to something fairly similar to this. First thing you would have went through is you would have went through a check of your medical, kind of your history. How are you doing? We're going to check your teeth, we're going to check your hair. We're going to make sure that when you get in, you don't infect anybody who dies with any kind of illnesses or anything. Basically, they needed as many troops as they could get. So maybe if you have a cavity, we can overlook that. As long as you can jump over that rock and run down to that tree and make it back, and you don't have to have a heart attack, we're probably going to, they would put you into service. They were at Camp Laddie in Napoleon from October to December of 1861. That meant, and it's kind of, I guess, in a way funny to think about, or maybe awkward to think about, but the men were responsible for camping there. They were enlisted in the military. They could not just go gallivant around. They weren't going to be able to go home, even if they lived 1 block away. So you were enlisted. Once you go off to serve, you're not going to have those luxuries anyway. You need to get used to the field. They, there in Napoleon, lived in Sibley tents. They resemble kind of teepees. They're a wall-pull structure. They did not live in the dog tents that we oftentimes think of in Hollywood movies. After they had been checked, their health was inspected, they would be able to write 1 letter. That letter was the letter that would be carried with you in case you were killed. That would be what would go back to your wife or your mom or the girlfriend. What we see at Camp Laddie is they go through drills, training, firing of muskets, and they learn everything that they need to learn for when they go into combat. They are also issued one shirt, one pair of shoes, one of everything. You break it, you lose it, tough. We don't really have that many supplies, even though the North, again, was better equipped than the South. This is the jacket, standard issue jacket that you would receive. There was really no rhyme or reason to what size. They weren't going to check you and say, oh, small, medium, and large. So, you know, it'd be great for someone like me to be put in something like this. Anybody seen the movie Glory? Glory, yes. This jacket is from that filming of that movie. This was worn in that. It is not authentic, but it's a reproduction. That jacket there has an inside pocket. Commonly, that is what you see in the old photos when they're reaching in their jackets. Their hand is going inside that pocket. The reasoning, we don't know today why they were sticking their hands in their pockets. Rumor has it, but it's never been totally proven. When you see the generals and prominent men and they have their hand in the jacket, it meant that they were a Freemason. But we don't know for sure. Kepis, very common. The hat that everyone kind of associates with the Civil War, especially the Union Army here in the North. Actually, in Ohio, we were not issued kepis. This is more of an eastern theater, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, those regions there, and men coming from that area, New York, would be issued the kepi. Our men here in Henry County were wearing what they call slop hats. Not quite as cool looking or cool sounding. Slop hat, it's a black hat, it's just slop. So I brought the kepi because, of course, that's looks a little bit nicer. After they left Camp Laddie on January 21st, 1862, they were moved to Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio. The 68th Regiment there, which is their title they were given, they then took part in several battles for the remainder of their time. They would wind up being decimated once they left Napoleon. They lost up to about 1,000 men. They lost over half their men. So our guys here didn't. They did well. They fought well and were in parts. They were in every Confederate state except for Florida and Texas, all by foot or by train or by canal. So should be very, very proud of our guys. They fought, and I had to type this portion up. I'm not going to go through them all, but I did list off some of the most important ones that our men were in. They were at the battles of Fort Dawson, Shiloh, Raymond, the siege of Vicksburg. They were at the Atlanta campaign. They were at Sherman's March to the Sea. They participated in the Battle of Jonesboro, and they were also present when the surrender of Johnston's army took place. They also then, for all their service, they were in many battles, and that's why they lost so many men. They were also taken to the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. to be kind of saluted for their work for Abraham Lincoln. So, if you ever get a chance, the Henry County Historical Society dedicated a marker for Camp Laddie. That's at the boat ramp there. It's kind of sad to talk about all these Civil War locations, and they're known by boat ramps, ice cream parlors, and city pools. But there is now a marker dedicated by the Ohio Historical Society on behalf of the Henry County Historical Society that marks the corner of where they would have been listed at. I know that Henry County has a number of artifacts from Camp Laddie on exhibit, including buttons, a man's wedding ring. He didn't even make it out of Napoleon before he ditched that, apparently. Hopefully he lost it. Money and different items. So I'm going to kind of go through here some of the doctors and nursing things that our men in the area would have went through. I'm going to try to keep it a little lower key. I'm not going to get too graphic. If anyone feels uneasy, give me a hand or a stop, and I will. So when our men went out to the field, they had made it through the first initial, I guess, check with the doctor. Once they made it out to the field, they were issued one thing that became the #1 killer of all men during the Civil War. They were given a bar of soap. And all the men decided, we don't need soap. need soap when we were in Henry County. We didn't need soap when we were in Ohio. We're farmers, we're farm boys. It doesn't really matter. We had soap for it. And they ditched it. Really, that's the best way to describe it. And what happened was they got sick. They were in areas they'd never been in before. They weren't properly sanitizing themselves. And they got rid of the only sanitation they really had. They weren't washing their clothes. And then what you start to move into is you get in some of these camps where we're going to start doing some amputations. You get some flies flying around. You're not washing your dishes. You're not washing your hands. You're going to get a whole camp sick. And there was no treatment for that. So the #1 cause or killer of men during the Civil War was not bullets. It was not cannon fire. It was not even really any battle-related stuff itself. It was simply using soap. So now you'll go home and wash your hands. It's really important, apparently. So what I have here is a few items that were carried in the field. I have this photo I'm going to pass around. I would love to have a medical kit if anyone can get a hold of one for me. These retail even at reproduction at $1,000. So don't really have that kind of, but I would encourage you to take a look there at some of those tools as I'm going to go through that. First thing that would happen in the South, most of the campaigning and the wars that were fought were in the South. The Union would move in, battles would occur, and they would take over your home. They would come in, they would say, that's great, you encourage slavery, you are supporting your Southern men, that's great, doesn't matter, you're going to support us now, we're taking over your home. Right down here in the front, I have an original piece of carpeting from the 1860s that came out of a house in Henry County. Just kind of wanted to give you an idea of the kind of carpet that was being used back then. It is cotton. It doesn't really take stains very well, and it certainly doesn't take the stains well of men using your home as a hospital. It would have been expensive if you would have gone into a home like that. Seen that kind of carpeting, they had some money. Major field hospitals that were used, plantations. So that kind of carpeting would succumb to what we're kind of going to go through here. A medic would have carried with him a number of bottles, pills, prescribed medicines, things of that nature. Unfortunately, when you are dealing with anywhere from 300 to 1,000 men who need your attention, you don't have time to wait for general anesthetic to kick in. You're not going to get pills, you might run out of pills, and you're not going to be able to get any more. Contrary to popular belief, everyone talks about biting the bullet when you were going to be amputated or have any kind of surgery performed. You would not bite a bullet. They knew better than that. Here's a round ball that commonly were fired during the War of 1812. We see some uses of these during the Civil War, but predominantly we see the new technology of this stuff right here. So biting the bullet would not be a great idea. You already have a guy who's infected, possibly going to lose a leg, and now we're going to give him bullets to chew on. Great, now I got to take his teeth out too. So that is completely kind of fictitious. Another thing fictitious from the Civil War, let's give him a shot of alcohol before I amputate, before I do any kind of practice on him. Believe it or not, even back then they knew, what does alcohol do to your blood? Thins it. So I'm going to give Jack a guy up on a bunch of, Jack Daniels, because we're down in Tennessee and Kentucky, and he's going to bleed to death. So they were not passing the alcohol around. I'm sure the doctors probably were, but not to the patients. After the battle, there would be a crew that would go out. They would collect anyone who was injured or wounded. Bodies decaying or any death was left on the battlefield. Sometimes those bodies were left on the battlefield for up to 1 year, even up to 2 years. The major issue was, we just completed the battle, the war's not over, it's time to move on. And unfortunately, we don't have time to bury our comrades who are left behind. The people who would usually do that in the South, the slaves. They would get off work for the day, and then they would be responsible for going out and burying north, south, it didn't really matter, whatever men were around. Bodies would be brought back, wounded would be brought back to the plantation, they would be brought back to the homestead or some other kind of house. The women, this is a very important thing that I really touch on. This was what I did my studies on this last semester at PG, was the women during the Civil War. kind of got a few laughs every once in a while. What's a guy studying women during the Civil War for? I kind of developed my own little bit of a theory that women were actually very, very important in the Civil War. Women are always important in the war. The guys need to have a woman at home, knows that they care about them. They need to have that place. But more so than anything during the Civil War, women were active, very active at home. They already had children to take care of. And I cannot really express enough the amount of stress that they would then put on. I went as far as to say that while the men were out in the field fighting the war and the battle, the women were at home fighting wars and battles of their own. They had children to take care of, and now guess what? They have no man to do the farming. So now you add that on to your daily chores. I doubt too many of you women would really want to be responsible for farming the fields of Henry County. Maybe you would, but you want to have time for that. What we see is during this time period then in the South, these women are forced into becoming nurses to help either with the South or the North as we go into these doctors' units, these field hospitals. So women would come in, really wasn't a place for them to be, and we find that there's a dynamic shift that occurs between men and women. Women's places at the home with the children making food. Now we brought them into practice with the men. We're going to be amputating, we're going to be doing things that women shouldn't experience. So you start to see by 1862, 1863, rounding our way off towards the end of the war even, the relationship between men and women really changed. Men are really starting to look at women as like a powerful force, like, wow, these women can really help us out, especially when the men are getting short. So women would come into these homes, they would be in these homes already as their homes were taken over, and then they would be subjected to handing tools over to the doctor. What would happen is a body would be brought in, it would be laid down on a large table. A doctor would take you over your home, he would want south-facing windows. Anybody know why? Sunlight. They can operate, they can do what they need to do, as long as they can do it. Another big thing that would happen with those windows, every window in the house would get opened up. You would need a good flow of air as they began to bring anywhere from 300 to 1,000 men into your home. The men would get put on tables, they would get on couches, they would be literally laying on anything that was available. Floors, and then the overflow waiting room would be outside in your garden or your yard. Once they were laid down, they would be given hopefully some kind of anesthesia, typically not. Then what would happen is our Union or Southern doctor would go in, and if that photo was floating around, we have a nice big lancet blade here. It looks like a bayonet, essentially. They would take a look at the arm or the leg that was shot, mangled, or otherwise infected, or possibly going to become infected. They would bust out their journal or book that gave them a step-by-step guide on how to take that arm or that leg off. This is just a copy of one. I'm going to pass it around. It's kind of, I guess, detailed, so I'm going to pass it on by without looking at it. That's fine. I have, also with this, as we go into this, I have two other photos up here of two gentlemen. The one man has had both arms blown off. The other boy has lost both legs. He's about 17 years old. The original photos, copies that you can look at later. I'm not going to pass those around, just because of how they are. Then I have one photo. It's the only existing photo. I made a copy of it. A pile of arms and legs after a battle. I'm also not going to pass that around if you want to look at that. So you take that big lancet blade, and then what would happen is that would be inserted. It would go around the arm or the leg. That incision or that slit would take 20 seconds. During the Civil War, by this point, if you were going to be a surgeon and you were going to be well trained, you were going to be able to get an arm or leg off in about 2 to 3 minutes flat. Once that arm or leg was done, let's get on to the next one. It literally became almost just a chop house. Once that tool was done, it would go back in. The women would wash it off in a bowl like this. The water would not be quenched, so we're going to rinse it off, and then we're going to go to that next guy. Then, once we had taken that meat and that skin around, the skin would be pulled back so that once you would detach that arm or that leg, you would have a nice fold of skin that you could fold around. And basically the goal was, this was the first modern forms of plastic surgery. They wanted to try to make you look as decent as possible. Taking out some of the steps that are a little bit more grotesque, we would come to the very, everyone waits for it, of course. You would go for your song, the bonus song. And then that would be placed on, and again, you know what happens from there. Once that had been pulled out, that arm or that leg, it would be thrown into a mass pile. Typically that pile would be off to the left-hand side of the table. If I was working this way, the leg would go over here. That's when the women would come through, they would pick it up, and they would move that body part into the larger pile. When in a home, on your nice carpeted floors that you women have been taking care of, that pile typically, actually, weirdly, would not be taken outside. Usually would be thrown into the corner of the room until the sun had set. And then it would be removed. So now your carpeted floors are dyed red, it's soaking down into the wood, and the sun has now kicked the temperature up at Gettysburg, Antietam, or any of the other battles. We're teetering around 100 degrees. Once that had been removed, we're going to go into these cute little guys. These are the scissors I had offered you to. She was going to open up all the food and stuff with these scissors. You would go in, all the arteries, blood vessels, anything that for whatever reason you had not been able to get a clean cut through, you were going to snip each and every one of them off. Then your female assistant would come over, and what would happen is she would release the tension on the arm or the leg, and the blood would start to come through all those veins and all those arteries, and he would begin to bleed out. As quickly as he could then, the female or the surgeon would go in, they would take each vein, they would take each individual piece that was bleeding out, and they would tie it up. Then they would take that, fold the skin around, flip it up, and then you would take your thread. Now, you can imagine we've had to do a considerable amount of work to get this guy to the shape he is, and now we have to stitch him up. That also means that thread was going rampant. There was very little thread left during the Civil War. So much of it had been used because of amputations and other wounds. So they began to use horsehair. They would go out, they'd say, cut the tail off the horse, bring it on in, we'll start to use horsehair to sew these men up. Great. Now they're getting infected from that. The other problem was horsehair. I'm sure how many of you have touched a horse's tail or seen a horse. It's kind of coarse, it's not very pliable. They began to boil it. They decided, let's boil this horsehair, because that would make it a little bit more pliable for stitching up these men. So they started bringing this horsehair back in, and they started sewing these guys up. And the guys who were recording and taking notes for the medical school in Washington, D.C. were saying this is really, really strange. Where the guys that we stitch up with thread usually are getting infections and they're dying. They're getting gangrene, other issues like that. These guys over here that have the horsehair, they're not getting sick as much, or their limbs are not deteriorating as quickly. They don't seem to be getting infections. And finally, nobody really knows who it was. Somebody said, I wonder if it's because we're boiling it. And they did a little bit of research and they found out the heat and the boiling of the horsehair had disinfected the materials they were using. So then what happens is we start to see the women responsible and the slaves responsible for boiling massive pots of water so they can boil and scorch their medical tools to try to clean things up. Major issue was, it sounds like a great idea in theory. Again, 300 guys you gotta see, you don't have time for it. Water cools off, we got other things we gotta worry about. So, I have a few different needles up here you can check out. I have this curved one here that's just in general, that would have sped up your process a lot more. It's got a nice scoop, so as soon as you push it in, you can pull it right back, and it's going to come right back through. The standard stitching for the time period was a Y stitch. It kind of looked like this. Or then you have the baseball stitch. That's kind of where that stitching comes from today. So that is, in a nutshell, and as least, I guess, uncomfortable as possible, the amputation process there. Once you had your limbs or your arms removed, you would be removed from the doctor's table, you would be put out in the home, or possibly pushed out, put out in the front yard, not pushed out, carried out in the front yard where you would be laid to recover. Typically, you suffered simply, not because you were bleeding to death, they did a very good job stitching you back up. The biggest issue again was just infection. Once those wounds were stitched up, there were other men to see, so they weren't going to wash it for you. They weren't going to clean it for you. There was no nursing of that nature, really. And again, medical pills and everything really weren't administered to you after you had the surgery, because it's unfortunate sounding, but just the most time and attention you would get is when you're on the table. And that was not the time and the attention you really wanted to be getting. Basically what the men clung to at that point was their faith. I have two Bibles here that are original from the time period. This black Bible here, it's in kind of rough shape. Doesn't help when your friends spill their bottle of water on it. But this is from the South. This came from Virginia. This Bible was published in 1857. It was owned by the Gifford family. And inside of that, they have the baptisms and the wedding records of that family in the South. And then this Bible here is from the North. This is from 1859. And their names are written on the inside, Hannah and Joseph Warren. And basically what you had was, during the Civil War, a huge, huge relationship with God, Jesus and the church. Women and the men clung to religion, because it's really all you had during the time period when you were living in such troubling times, I guess. Are there any questions so far? At all? I'm covering a lot, talking kind of fast. I have here one of the more famous men who received an amputation during the war was General Sickles. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of him. General Sickles is a very interesting fellow. He's seated there in the middle, and it seems the leg is missing. Actually, I'll just pass the photo around for you. He was actually hit by a cannonball right on the thigh bone here while he was on his horse. And they amputated his leg, and he decided, since he was kind of arrogant, he was a little different, he decided, you know what, I'm a general in the Union Army, and I want my leg put on exhibit. I want people to see it. So he donated it to Washington, D.C., and it should be now in the Smithsonian Institute, with the cannonball that supposedly took his leg off. Ironically, after the war, he would make multiple trips throughout his life to go visit his leg. And he got pretty notorious for that. Along with that photo, you can come up and look at this. This is an original check, signed, dated, and written for $11.50 by General Sickles. So if you want to come and check that out, that is from the war. General Sickles, fun fact off to the side about how different he was, is the first person acquitted in the United States for murdering someone. He gets off by pleading insanity. He killed his wife. So he's a different kind of guy. Two other items I have here that go along with the uniform is I have two original buckles. These are off of William Franklin Moyer's uniform that he wore at the Battle of Antietam. He was in the cavalry. He was from Pennsylvania, and he is my great-great-grandfather. And then I have here, we have three existing, I brought one of them, original photos of him in his uniform that he wore. The other photo I have is him actually dressed in his uniform that he wore at the Battle of Antietam. So, check out there. Are there any other questions on anything at all?
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
The Ohio Volunteer Infantry that some didn't go in until a little bit later in the war. What do you know about what kind of money they made?
Money they made. The soldiers reported it varied. Usually what we saw was, and I believe, it's been a while since I've read the report, the guys in Napoleon, or Henry County more or less, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they made somewhere around $7 a month, which, I mean, by standards of today's times doesn't sound like much, but back then it was not well paid. It was all right. Basically, one of the major issues with that, socially, as we look at the farming that they were doing, was it better off to go off and leave the farm and be potential money you would make off of that crop, or just enlist and go serve. During this time period, it might have kind of lost its luster today, but during this time period, it was a very, very, very honorable thing to go serve your nation, whether you were south or north. You went and you served. If you stayed home, there was a good reason, and it was helping mom on the farm. Maybe there were 6 brothers, and 2 of them were going to stay home. So there's that. There's a lot of stories from the Civil War when it comes to payments. People who didn't get paid, people who shouldn't have gotten paid as much as they did. So. Any other questions on anything?
Yeah, there were black troops too.
There were what? I'm sorry.
Black men too.
Yes, there were several black Union infantry troops that went in. They were typically what they were runaway slaves. They escaped to the north, and it was pretty interesting to see a black regiment on the battlefield in the South fighting against the Confederates. That is actually what the movie Glory hits very heavily on, is the black infantry, and it shows kind of the components that went along with being a white officer in the Union Army, and you're giving a black, unit. Not always highly respected, other times you were, and then you kind of see the dynamic shift where these officers really do realize, wow, these guys are just like us. They have families, they have dreams, and they have hopes, and not as much opportunity. Yes?
Were those soldiers from Henry County?
The black troops?
No. The pictures. The pictures.
Oh, no, those are all officers that were with sickles at the Battle of Gettysburg. None of those are from our area. Most notably and famously from our area is, of course, General Scott. He was in charge of the 68th Infantry. His house still stands in Napoleon, Scott Mansion. He led the men for most of their campaign, and he was really, at the end of the war, kind of an interesting fact. He brought their barber home. The barber for the 68th was a black former slave that they had picked up in the South. And when he brought him back to Napoleon after the war, he said, I'm going to set you up in business in Napoleon. We're going to open a barber shop for you. It's going to be great because everyone's going to go. They're going to support you. You can get away from that Southern lifestyle. And everyone in the regiment said there's not a chance. Once he goes up into the north and Napoleon, he's going to be the only black man. Nobody's going to support a black man. There's white barbers that we can go to. Ironically enough, we see where there's a component of racism locally here. And he came back and he had one of the most successful barber businesses in Napoleon because General Scott, who was the former governor of the area of Ohio, was his #1 customer. And if he's a good enough barber for the governor and the leader of the 68th, he's a good enough barber for me. And today that barber is buried right behind General Scott in Glenwood Cemetery with the rest of the guys from the 68th. General Scott's grave is in Glenwood Cemetery. It's the large mausoleum. It's got about six tombs there, including his wife. Another regiment, their doctor, one of the doctors that came out of the 68th was Dr. John Bloomfield. His house is the Dr. John Bloomfield Museum, run by the Henry County Historical Society. So, kind of ties all those names together a little bit. Yeah.
Was there any opportunity around here for them to join the Navy, or was that mostly East Coast?
That's mostly, yeah, the Eastern Theater. You see a lot of the Navy things. Basically what you had here was you were serving what was offered.
What was offered,
yeah. You would have had room to maybe, move up the ranks, but you weren't, unfortunately it's not like today. You weren't going to walk in and go, I want to be in the Navy. It just didn't work that way. The infantry men that we see, and especially the 68th, it's kind of a sad, it is a sad tale, because really, those groups were the bruns. They came in from Henry County, you came in from Wood County, Fulton County, and those regions. You were you know, kind of viewed as the uneducated farming boy. You're a strong farmhand boy, and you can go shoot guns. And that's kind of the way it went.
I was just wondering if Navy stuff on Lake Erie, or was that all gone by then?
That was all gone by then. Yeah, after the War of 1812 at the end there with Oliver Hazard Perry, all Lake Erie issues have simmered, or, you know, smoked out. A lot of, yeah, your Navy is in the Carolinas and places along that coast there.
Where is the Scott Mansion?
Scott Mansion sits right down, are you familiar with the Dr. Bloomfield Museum across from the Napoleon Public Library? Straight down that road. You're just going to follow it, Clinton Street, it's on Washington Street. Follow Washington Street down, and it's on the corner there on the right. It's masked and hidden by the pine trees and the huge growth around it. It's really difficult to kind of see, but it is a very large home. And very interesting house at that.
One of the urban legends is that it was part of the Underground Railroad.
Right. There's a lot of urban legends about homes in Henry County being on the Underground Railroad. And the biggest thing I find, which is sometimes a little frustrating, is people love their local lore, and sometimes it's just not based on fact. General Scott's house is built in Victorian architecture, and that means it was after the Civil War that it was really constructed. We also find with other homes I've looked at in Napoleon that people have claimed, they've even started using it with the 150th anniversary I've found through, interesting enough, Maritime Realty. People have started claiming their houses were using the Underground Railroad to try to make them more marketable. And the homes weren't even built during the Civil War. They were built in like 1880, 1890. One of the homes that I investigated about a month ago was built in 1915. Missed the boat on that one. The only two real reported cases I've come across Underground Railroad in Henry County is there's a home that's still standing in Florida, Ohio. That is the Burgundy House on the left-hand side, backs up to the canal. Sorry that that's so big. It might still be, it was an antique store.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've been inside that home, and it was used as the jail. It was used to jail drunks who would come through on the canal boat. And when there weren't the drunks in the jail, the slaves would pass through, and they would hide them in the jail. And part of the reasoning was on that was if somebody showed up and said, "You're hiding slaves," they would say, "Nope, we caught them. They're in the jail." And people would go, "Oh, yeah." And then they would mosey on, and then in the cover of darkness, they would let them out. The jail cell is still there. The bars are still there. It's completely the day it looks when the last slave left it. It's so weird. I mean, it's very neat. And out back behind was a blacksmith shop. And the blacksmith, when he was working, you could see the slaves leave on the post on the top of the blacksmith shop. He would make a mark for each slave that left. And then somebody came through and tore the building down. So that's not there anymore. The second stop on the Underground Railroad is in Ridgeville Corners, and that building is still there, but it's rapidly deteriorating. So if anyone wants to restore it, I encourage it. It's the church that sits on the right-hand side. You're going towards Northwest State. It's on your right-hand side. It's surrounded by the cemetery. That church, they were actually having a Sunday mass service, and there were slaves in the basement, and the congregation didn't even know it. And they said that the reports show that that was literally the most terrifying moment for those slaves as they sat underneath and could hear everyone walking and singing during the service. And finally, after Sunday school, everyone left the building. And then when darkness fell, they said, "Let's get the heck out of here." But that was the stop. 2 stops, that's all I know of. Yes.
Question that my son did a report on a house across from Lolly's, I don't know what's it called,
Yes.
store or whatever. And the people that lived there told him all kinds of things about the Underground Railroad, that they were, that house, they use.
Lolly's Marine there, it was the brick home in the junkyard, I believe?
It's across the road,
Okay,
south, it's just right across the, well, it's back this way.
okay.
No, there's a big barn, they sell books or something.
Okay.
Barn. Culbertson's, yes.
Well, I by no means, because I'm saying that those are the only two documented cases that I've come across, I'm not refuting that other homes were involved in the Underground Railroad at all, because one thing that, we really need to, realize too is it was the Underground Railroad, it was illegal. Even in the north, we might not, didn't like slavery up here, you were hiding property that was stolen from the south. And there was huge laws against it. You could go to jail, you could be fined, you could lose your home over it. So, a lot of the homes that were used under, for the Underground Railroad, today we might not even know it because, you just didn't talk about that. So, I'm sure there might have been, my biggest thing that I've kind of come across when I research is Napoleon, we are still the city in Henry County. And I do kind of find it hard to believe that some of these homes people claim might have been in the Underground Railroad are like right downtown in Napoleon. And I think when you look at Florida and Ridgeville, those are outskirting. Like McClure, it's outskirting. It's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit less likely to get caught. I just find it hard to believe you're going to bring slaves through downtown Napoleon, even if in the cover of darkness, and risk those kinds of repercussions.
I understand there were more Americans died in the Civil War than all other wars put together. And I can't honestly say that, but that's what I understand.
Any numbers I kind of look at, because I'm not a numbers guy, but I guess I should be, that's quantitative history, right? I can't for sure answer that, but I can say I have looked at the numbers of specific battles, and it's really intriguing how there's certain battles that are labeled a Union victory, but yet the Union lost tons more men. Even in those battles that they won, there was one battle I was looking at just the other night, I believe it was the Battle of Franklin, where the Confederates had lost a substantial amount of men, and the Union had lost around, oh my goodness, it was like 12,000 more, and it's still a Union victory. And then they have, in a little box down in the corner, it says, but inconclusive, tactically it would be a Union victory, but on numbers, not so. So it makes it really, really difficult. Regardless, we lost millions and millions of men. It was terrible. So, any other thoughts, questions, or?
I've heard that the castaways in Ohio and Henry County probably had the biggest percentage of their population in the Civil War of any state.
The 68th and the areas here did have substantial numbers. What we saw, and one of the main reasons the 68th went to Washington, D.C. was the amount of support that was brought from the region was very, very substantial. And when you look at how we are actually still an agricultural society here during the Civil War, we weren't industrialized here in Henry County, really. It is remarkable the amount of men that left when they had so much more responsibility on the farm here at home. And I don't think there's really any pinpointed reason why the men here in this area were so profound and so adamant, I guess, or supportive of Abraham Lincoln and the Union. But it really is remarkable. One of the main things that I found when it came to Lincoln was everyone has kind of wondered and questioned why was he so anti-slavery. And on the way down to the south here just a week ago, looking at his boyhood home, unbeknownst to a lot of people, we don't really look at it even in our textbooks and when we're growing up in school, was when he was a boy and would sit out front and help his mom in the garden. they would parade the slaves past, shackled to one another, like cattle. And at such a young age, Abraham Lincoln sat there and he looked at that and he just thought, you know, Mom, that's not right. Those are people. You can't use people like that. And he pictured himself working in the garden with his mom, and he couldn't, as a child, understand why, well, we're capable of working in the garden. Why aren't they down there? Why do we need to use these other people shackled together to do it? And that just had such an impression on him that by the time he took political office, he said, we're going to be done with that. So, any other questions or thoughts on anything? It was notated and kind of asked by the Historical Society here that after I concluded my Civil War area, if anyone was interested, that there was a great interest last time on ghost stories and folklore of Henry County. And judging by their sign, they had notated that, and I didn't want to go too long on that, mainly because it's not really my area, I guess, just because folklore is kind of, fictitious and all those things along the line. But one thing I found most interesting was General Scott. And anything that I could tie to this presentation was General Scott himself because of his mansion and the rumors that are about his mansion. When it was constructed, it was claimed that General Scott built tunnels so he could circumnavigate and go into Napoleon, and even a tunnel that went all the way to the river. That's where the big kind of mystery comes, that he was probably a part of the Underground Railroad, because they figured the slaves entered that tunnel through the Maumee River, they came to his house, they hid, and then they were gone. The Napoleon City building has no record of any tunnels at Scott Mansion. When they've dug sewer lines, when they've dug for wires, when they've put roads in, they've never come across a single tunnel. So, sorry to burst the bubble on that legend. Another one is General Scott said before he died that there was a secret room in Scott's mansion, in his house. And he said the only way to find that room would be to actually tear the house down. Inside of that, he claimed, was his safe with all his money, several personal items from the Civil War itself, and other family heirlooms. That room has never been found. People who have lived in the house claim they've knocked on walls, they've even thought about removing some of the walls to try to find this room. And then the big issue is the entire house is built in 3 layers of brick. So the interior walls of that house are 3 layers of brick. So you probably, tear the house down, and not to mention destroy the historical value of it. So as much hunting has happened, General Scott's mystery of where that room is still lingers to this day. Another fun one about General Scott was he was put on trial after the Civil War in Napoleon. He had gone downtown. Everybody knows the Scott trial. Heard of that? General Scott had a son who had gone downtown Napoleon, and it's reported he had had too much to drink. And the guy he had been drinking with lived across from Spangler's in downtown Napoleon, which was there at that time. And he went to visit him, and he said, "Boy, you are so drunk, you should not go home. Your dad's going to, whip you." So when he asked him to stay the night, well, General Scott, in the middle of the night, could not find his son. He was very frustrated by this, so he went downtown to look for his son, and someone had tipped him off of where the son had been staying. So he stopped by. The gentleman claimed that his son was not there. General Scott got a little agitated, called him out on the street, and in typical 1860s style, shot him on the street in downtown Napoleon. He left, the man bled to death, and he died. He had fumbled back upstairs. He died on the 2nd floor of Avina's t-shirt shop. That's where his apartment was, and that's the original building today. I would say Avina should have their logo redesigned and have a body outline or something. really well known. But General Scott then went on trial. His trial was held above Went's shoe store. Why they didn't use the courthouse, I honestly don't know. But it drew a lot of media attention, and it actually went national. And he wound up using the excuse or the reasoning that the gun went off accidentally. And everyone said, yeah, but you were in the Civil War, you're a general, you know how guns fire, somebody's finger had to have been on the trigger. And there was a lot of disagreement in the courtroom, and everyone said eventually, you know what, he's too high profile, he was in the Civil War, he was a great leader, probably should let him off, and we should just let him off scot-free. And to this day around America, when you hear the saying scot-free, it came from General Scott, because he got off scot-free. Lucky son of a gun. So he lived the rest of his life in the mansion there, and then he passed away, and again, he was buried in Glenwood Cemetery. Now today, depending on who you ask, including the homeowner, General Scott, didn't really go to Glenwood Cemetery. His spirit supposedly still lingers in the home there, and the owners have claimed that he does appear on the top landing of the stairs. He'll walk down the bottom landing of the stairs and put his arm on the banister, and he'll turn around and look into the family room where they've been watching TV when this has happened, and he will disappear. They claim that he is dressed head to toe in his Union uniform from the Civil War. Whether that is true, I don't know. I've never seen him. Don't want to see him. But that's the legend of Scott's Mansion. So, I can keep going or I can stop. Question? Yes.
That trunk, is that what most of the people are asking?
Yeah, I've been weirdly using it as a podium, which I didn't mean to do, but this is what you would see the medics carry. This would be loaded on the back of a wagon. You would fit all your medical tools and equipment in there. Poor everyday soldier, our guys from the 68th Ohio, gosh, I'll tell you, if it couldn't be carried on their back, they didn't get to take it. One more reason why I would need one of everything. It's just a standard wooden trunk. Everything that would be there's nothing in it now. General Sickles here. Because everything else would go inside of it. By the middle part of the Civil War, you see the first uses of the hearse being developed, and wagons for carrying and dealing specifically, of course, there would have been transportation of bodies since the dawn of time, but specific carriages for bodies, medical equipment, and things of that nature. Field hospitals on wheels, basically, is what those were. Yeah.
Would the soldiers mostly get from one place to another, like by walking?
Specifically, yes. They would have, General Scott would be disappointed in me. He would have hollered at us and said, no, we marched from place to place. But our men here in Napoleon, they went up and they got right on the railroad tracks that are there at, they cut right through downtown Napoleon. The railroad tracks come out of the city pool. That's where they got on the train. And then that's the train that took them to Camp Chase. That train track, this is a fun fact too, right through downtown Napoleon, that train track Abraham Lincoln rode through downtown Napoleon on his way, on his campaign trail to go out and seek re-election. So he passed right through Napoleon. Never got the chance to, get elected. But when it comes, that's it. Once they were on the trail, the railroad track, and they came to Camp Chase, the men were boarded onto a canal boat. They took the canal boat down to the lower part of Ohio, and then at that point, once they reached the end of the road for Ohio, they were forced to march the rest of the way. And when I made notation about how they were in every Confederate state except for Florida and Texas, when you look at Georgia, that's a heck of a long walk or march from the bottom of Ohio. So their shoes would get blown out. Many of the men would not get replacement shoes until the next stop. And once you were in the South, you were kind of at the mercy of the South because you had the Confederates coming through and causing problems, stealing, and then again, of course, the battles. So you'd have a lot of shoes that had just been just themselves decimated by war, packing full of fabric or other materials that you would have, cutting off the sleeve of the jacket, put stuff under the toes so your toes don't get frostbite. Because again, you wind up on this table if your toes get frostbite. So, we've been a really rough life. Any other questions?
Issue weapons to the soldiers?
Did they issue weapons to the soldiers? Yes. If you would have,
They take the room.
if you would have been in Napoleon and Henry County, and you would have showed up with your musket from, you know, the Revolutionary War, you know, grandpa's, they would have been like, no, we have government issued muskets for you, and then along with that, your bullets and all your other supplies that you would need, your black powder. Now the Confederate States running low on supplies and not having the manufacturing capabilities always to get a hold of weapons, you would see a little bit more usage of, you know, the ring and gun. But, you know, the Confederate States wound up being very well equipped with guns also, because you got to remember, the war was supposed to last 3 months. So.
So actually, how long did that war last?
Well, historically, well, we look at 1861 all the way up to 1865. So, yeah, right. So, you know, all these men that were at Camp Laddie were enlisted for 3 months. And then we get into the thick of things, and, you know, there's photos of Abraham Lincoln when he started the war, and photos after the war, and his hair had just fallen out, his wrinkles, he looked like he had aged 60 years in a short amount of time. And, you know, 3 months the war was supposed to be over, and there was no way. There was not even a sign of it being over. So all these men are getting out, or supposedly supposed to get out, and Abraham Lincoln's going, holy moly, we've got to keep these guys in. And then you see a whole new shipment and enlistment of men that either, you know, they go home or they sign on again for a much longer term.
There was a lot of 6 months men,
Right.
and then there was a lot of them re-enlisted in 3 years.
Right. Yeah, it was, I mean, it's really interesting, and you can tell Abraham Lincoln was, by that point, not that he didn't initially do his research, I think he just had a lot of hope for his country, and rightfully so. After the Revolution and the War of 1812, you know, we win wars apparently in America as a young nation, and 3 months should do it, and then when it didn't, you're right, everything, the enlistment period really picked up. 6 months, 3 years, I mean, he was ready to hit the Confederate States head on. So. Anybody seen the movie Lincoln? Has anyone seen Lincoln? So. Any other thoughts, questions, or? Certainly encourage everyone to come up and take a look around. I would ask for a volunteer for some of the surgical stuff, but I think you'd appreciate that too.
You did mention, when you were here before, you mentioned a house, was that shown? That was.
Yeah, there's a lot of houses.
Well, but.
Shunk's Legends of Ghosts, and then
Yeah.
I might have talked about Shunk. Did I talk about Shunk and Edwards or no?
But
McClure and their ghosts, these people, when I come over here, that's fun.
I just remember you mentioning it, I think it was a house.
Yeah, Shunk, that house is still there too. It's just dressed in its finest 2013 sighting that you can get. It's actually an original log house. It sits on the right-hand side as you're going into Shunk there. And
The first house?
it's brown.
Okay.
It's brown, 2-story, right-hand side as you're heading towards the bridge. I think that,
First house, where the sign?
I think so.
Sure, family lived there.
She did? How long did she live there?
She was 97.
Oh, okay. Did she ever tell you anything about it?
70 years, no?
Well, that's
But
good.
her husband, who was from that area, talked about the treasure, the buried treasure,
Right.
that she looked for some.
I'm not sure if maybe we had the same house then or not, because I know the house that exists today, when it was purchased in, the early 2000s, it on the outside appeared to be old and didn't look too bad. It could be refurbished and everything. Then when they went on the inside and they actually like purchased it, the walls had been knocked out and the floors had been knocked out, big holes because people had searched the house for the hidden treasure. And then when the people finally started to work on the house, odd things started to happen. And some of the photographs and some of that stuff was showing some images that were pretty spooky. And I mean, folklore and ghost stories, apparently the house was haunted. It was believed to be haunted by an Indian spirit. And then when doing some documentation or whatever, they had found that a Native American did live in the house after the Indians were removed in the 1830s here in Northwest Ohio. And she had been practicing, I guess, not voodoo because they don't practice voodoo, but she'd been practicing, you know, some natural spiritual things in the attic. And when actually going into the attic, they did find in the rafters of the ceiling smudge sticks, wrapped herbs, and things of that nature, which only began to spook them out a little bit worse, and they sold the house. And then Shunk, of course, has the warrior on the white horse that protects the guarded treasure that nobody's ever found. So, and ironically, the pond, if you cross the bridge in Shunk, I'm sure everyone's crossed the bridge in Shunk. On the left-hand side, there's a white house, and there's a pond there. That pond was dug by a guy who was looking for the treasure back in the, I think in the 30s and the 40s. He decided that the land was for sale, I'll just buy it, I'm going to dig it up, and I'm going to find this treasure. Because that's the side it's on, I just have a feeling. No, it wasn't. So, it just turned it into a pond. Is the treasure there? I don't know. I find it, I don't know. I'm not going to go looking for it. Any other thoughts, questions? Or I don't want to take up anyone's time. Ghost stories of Henry County or anywhere else, or Civil War history, or any other history questions at all?
Some of the old letters that were written home by some of the Civil War people are really interesting.
Yeah, I did a lot of reading on Civil War letters here this last semester when I was studying women during the Civil War. I came across a letter by a gentleman who had written to his girl at home, and he flat out says in the letter, I don't know, I can't believe it. He says, I just want you to know, I've been writing 6 other women since I've been gone. And the only reason I picked you to be my girlfriend and I want to marry you when I get home is you're a really good cook. He flat out says it. And while I don't really know what her response was, yeah, what a jerk. But on the same, you know, I guess point of that is it shows you the time period. Cooking was important, so
Still is.
still. Yeah.
The way you were making stones, or artists.
Yeah, there's some. Yeah. So he had, 7 women he had been writing to. He was definitely playing the matchmaker game there, and the cooking skills. So, yeah, the letters are very interesting. A lot of them are very disheartening. Northwest State Community College has an excellent collection of original letters from the Civil War, and you read his letters. He talks a lot about his friends getting sick and then passing away. And he is just your everyday soldier. He had been enlisted in Defiance, and he went to the Defiance group. And his letters are, if you really get into it, or if you have a heart for history, or even just people in general, when you read about some of the things he saw, these guys were, a lot of them fit. We're talking 16 years old to 24 years old, and things they saw, and certainly the things even the women experienced were really remarkable and really, really tragic too.
You talked a little about the prisons they had during the Civil War. Do you have any?
Johnson's Island?
There's a prison in the South.
Andersonville prison. Yes, Andersonville prison. I was going to bring some photos from Andersonville, funny enough, but I didn't know, didn't want to talk too long. Andersonville prison was a Confederate prison down in the South, and it was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, it was they sent the Union troops there, and anyone who had been really captured in that area. And there's a movie out, and I believe it's just called Andersonville. I've seen that a couple times. That's another very, very sad story. They had built a stockaded wall, just like a fort, kind of like Fort Meigs is up there in Perrysburg, stockaded wall, and inside of that they built a railed fence, just a railed fence, about 10 yards back from that stockaded wall. And it was a known fact to the prisoners that if you crossed under that fence, they would shoot you on sight. And what happened was they began to run out of supplies. They started to care less and less about the troops as the war went on, and they began to basically systematically starve the Union troops to death. They weren't getting them supplies for tents or housing. They would dig in the mud, and they would bury down like 3 foot into the dirt to try to get out of the hot sun, have some kind of cool space in the South. Very crude tents. Instead of using their blankets to sleep on, they might try to rig it up to where it could, put some shade over their head. Their teeth start falling out. Again, they're going to the bathroom everywhere. Dysentery is a huge problem. And then eventually, towards the end of the war, what you see is, and the photos I was going to bring some of those photos, but I just decided not to, is the men that did survive were literally, if you get even fact, they were skeletons. They were walking skeletons. There was nothing left.
They tell the story about the 2 Harmon brothers over in, and Bill Harmon was a pretty good-sized man, and he weighed 78 pounds.
Yeah, 78 pounds. A lot of the men began to kind of take matters into their own hands, and that railing I talked about, they would walk. A lot of them crawl, unfortunately. Very sad. They would crawl under it intentionally, so they would get shot. Other men would walk on their knees underneath that railing, so they would be shot, put out of their misery. The movie is very good, but it's also very sad. It's not not something you want to watch. I guess if you're looking for a good film on Saturday or anything, but it's very historically significant, very historically accurate. Now, bringing it more localized here. Kind of the reversal of that. Johnson's Island up near, it's on the Sandusky Bay, Lake Erie area there. Been out there several times. Johnson's Island was the reversal. It was the Union prison for the Confederates, and they would take them up there. They would house them on the island there. And, that's pretty remarkable to think about, too. You're a guy from Georgia. You're from Carolinas. And you're being housed on Johnson Island in northwest Ohio in a prison camp. Look how far these men are from home. Really, these boys were from home. Fortunately, the same kind of circumstances begin to happen there. People get sick, food is low, and men start dying. Up on Johnson's Island to this day, there is the Confederate cemeteries there, where those men that never made it home. It's a very nice place, very quiet place. They have a very nice monument there. It's a really interesting place to go, considering it's a northwest Ohio Confederate cemetery. That's a nice place to go on a Saturday or Sunday, drive out there. There's a bridge that connects it, so it makes it very easy to go over there and access that. I would encourage that some Sunday if you have time. So.
What kind of living quarters did they have for the men in the winter and so forth?
The men in the winter lived in the same kind of quarters they lived in the summer, and that would be their tents. Except for maybe, one difference was is you would close the flaps on your tent. I know that sounds, kind of silly, but that's all the shelter they had. Perhaps if you were passing through a city or a town, or if you could manage to sweep in and take over a farm, kind of how we talked about taking over houses for doctors. Hopefully you could get your hands on some straw, and then you could pack it into your tent. Then a lot of times what you saw is those little dog tents or pup tents. You'd have 6 to 7 men sleeping in those sometimes, because then you could build up that body heat. And then they actually talk about sometimes in some of those letters home, where if one man rolled over, all the men would have to roll over, because it was just one big spoon collection of men. Not to take it back that route again, but the Civil War was a dark time in our history. That also meant one guy got sick, everyone got sick. We're sleeping right on top of each other. So, every man would be given one blanket, so, and that's the same in the winter. One blanket, one wool blanket, and then they were also given, there's a lot of people who were surprised by them when I've gone in other places. They always are like, where'd this tarp come from? And it was just basically a rubberized tarp that they could drape over them. They could drape it over a tent, hang it over themselves, put it over their supplies, and that repelled the water. But again, not very big. It's not going to keep the ice out. So their living conditions were terrible. Any other questions?
Was there ever any kind of a memorial for the Civil War soldiers in Erie County?
We are the only county in the state of Ohio that does not have a monument for our soldiers. Henry County is the only one.
It's kind of disgusting.
Yeah, as soon as you asked that, I was like, oh boy. Yes, it is. It really doesn't bothers me, yes. Every community you go into, typically you always see it. It's the large obelisk, and then it's got the Union soldier standing on it with the musket in hand, usually has the frocked coat on. That is the monuments that were erected after the Civil War, with all the men who served, all the men who passed away, the generals, officers, and of course we would have medics, barbers, and everyone listed on there. Only county that doesn't have one. Why? I do not know. And I had someone say to me, well, we have the Ohio Historical Society marker now that marks Camp Laddie. That should be good enough. I said, I don't think so. It doesn't list every man that was killed. It doesn't really list anyone. But then again, as we were talking earlier about historic sites, that is an awfully large project with an awful lot of funding you would need. But it's not too late. It's the 150th anniversary of the Civil War right now as we stand here, and there's a couple more years left. So you never know. That'd be really nice. Any other questions?
Do you live in Napoleon?
Yes, I do live in Napoleon. I commute to Bowling Green, back and forth to go to school. But yep, Napoleon is my home base. I work at Napoleon High School with the band, and then I'm the drama director there. So education and that kind of thing is really my passion, I guess. But history is my favorite.
Do they have records of all the people that were in the Civil War and who died?
In Henry County?
Well, Henry,
No. There are complete lists for certain units and certain regiments and everything, but there's no, a lot of places have partial lists. We know officially out of the men that left Henry County lost 300 guys. And at the Henry County Fair last year, I worked with the Veterans Bureau. They gave me 300 of the 2-foot flags that go on the graves at Memorial Day. I said, I'd really like to have 300 of those flags, but I want to put them up at the Henry County Fair, one for each one of those guys, since we don't have a memorial for them. And, 300 guys doesn't maybe sound like that much because of our wars today, or even the numbers and statistics from the Civil War itself. Let me tell you, you start putting those things in the ground, you start spacing it out, and you start looking at it, and you think about these are 300 of our men, that's a lot of guys. And they left Napoleon, and many of them never came back. They're buried between here and Georgia. Yes?
I think the St. Paul Methodist Church in Napoleon is going to have a film Lincoln at 7 o'clock this next Friday.
Next Friday at 7 o'clock at the Methodist Church in Napoleon there, right behind the Dr. Bloomfield home. Is showing Lincoln. Awesome. Yeah. Take advantage of that. That would be really neat. It's a very nice church over there too. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. And I encourage you to come up and look at things. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me.
Good.
Yeah.
We're going to have a treat.